Has been an eventful week this week. So it's good to be in the house of the Lord, put it that way. The governor changed our sort of rules on wearing masks and had to tighten them down because things are getting worse. And so you may see me take my glasses off now and then as I try to keep them from fogging up. But today's scripture is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. And I'm guessing that you've probably heard the story of Jonah and the whale. I mean, that's a pretty famous story, Jonah and the whale. Of course we've heard that. We see nursery decorations, we see toys, we see perhaps some of our earliest memories might be a picture of Jonah and the whale on the wall in a nursery somewhere. Most of us have probably seen the VeggieTales movie of Jonah and the whale. It's just one of those things. It's a part of our culture, in addition to being part of the Bible, and that's in some ways a good thing. But there is something that they usually get wrong. The thing we usually get wrong about Jonah and the whale is that story's not about a fish. It's really not about the fish. And I heard somebody talking about this story in the Bible the other day, and he said, the fish might be the most believable thing in the story. Because it's full of that story's full of amazing things. Do you know the word fish is only mentioned twice in the whole book of Jonah? The fish is only mentioned twice. God is mentioned 14 times. The word Lord is used 21 times. Even sackcloth is mentioned 3 times. But the fish, just twice. So Jonah's not really just about fish. Jonah's a love story. Jonah's a love story. It's a story about God's extravagant love for a city. God loved the city of Nineveh. That's what the story of Jonah is about. It's about God's love for a city that doesn't love him back. You might call it an unrequited love story. It's a story about the great lengths to which God would go to reach the city of Nineveh. The story of Jonah is not about the fish. The main character is not the fish. And truthfully, the main character is not Jonah. In fact, Jonah does almost everything wrong that he could possibly do wrong. There's very little that Jonah does right in the story, and yet, all these thousands of years later, we're talking about Jonah and what God did in his life. But that leads into this idea that the main character of the story is God. You can make an argument that God is both the antagonist and the protagonist of the story. It's God who sends a storm when Jonah is disobedient. It's also God who sends the fish to save Jonah. In fact, the story reveals much to us about who God is. So let's take a look at Jonah. Let's look at chapter 1. And we're going to read through chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. This is the first thing Jonah does wrong. But Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship and a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not all perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified him, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he'd already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. It's interesting that Jonah, the Hebrew prophet's running away from the Lord, but these Gentiles on the ship, they turn and start making sacrifices and vows to the Lord. In verse 17, "Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. 3 days and 3 nights. That sounds familiar. Now, if we flip over to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a short chapter, and it's kind of another important part of the story I want to think about today. In chapter 3, it says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That was his message. So the Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent, and with compassion turn from his fierce anger, so that we will not perish. When God saw what they did and how they had turned from their evil ways, he relented, and he did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. God relented. He didn't bring on them the destruction that he had threatened. What does Jonah teach us about God? The first thing I might point out is God calls us to some surprising, sometimes even ridiculous things. It's amazing how God works. Sometimes he asks us to do very small things. that have a giant impact. I remember years ago, and I've told this story before, but years ago, my wife and I were not where we should be with the Lord, and we were coming home from a vacation. We were coming home early because of some different things going on. And we decided to go to church, which wasn't a regular part of our life at that time. And there was a pastor there who had tickets to a Christian concert, and he had some extras, and he offered to give them to anybody that wanted them. And my wife and I like music, so we decided we wanted to go. And what we didn't know is the pastor gave them away to somebody else before we got there. And so then he gave us his tickets when we asked. Doesn't seem like, that was very nice. I wonder if he realized at the time that God would use that in an important way. Maybe he did. For my wife and I, it didn't seem like a big deal. We were home early, had some time on our hands, and I'd go to a concert. And we did, and that night during the concert, the music stopped, and one of the guys in the band read from, it was from one of the Gospels. I really don't remember which one of them it was. But that night, my wife and I dedicated our lives to Christ. Going to a concert is such a small, minor thing. And yet I feel God called us. God's grace was at work in our lives, at work in that pastor's life, at work in all sorts of ways we couldn't see, because he wanted us to be in the place, in the time, where he could once again remind us of who he is and his love for us. And our lives were changed. God works in surprising, sometimes even ridiculous ways. You just realize that one day you realize maybe I need to call somebody, and you call them and you find out that they really needed you. There's something going on and they needed you. Recently, I had a friend who was going through a hard time, and I needed to get an oil change, and I was driving to get to where the garage was. I had to go pretty close to where he lived. And so on the way back, I called him. And he was glad to hear from me, and he was kind of discouraged. And I said, well, that's funny. I'm about 10 minutes from your house. And the first thing he said when I got there was, God really wanted you to come see me today. And it was just because I was in the right place in the right time. And God just kind of tugged at my heart and said, you should call your friend. God speaks to us in strange ways. Jonah's call was to Nineveh. And that must have seemed crazy. Nineveh was part of the Assyrian Empire. These were the enemies of the Hebrew people. These were enemies of Jonah's people. And the truth is, they were violent people. I was reading this week, there's a work of art that still exists from the time of Jonah. It's like a carving in stone, a relief. And I may pronounce this wrong, but it's a relief titled The Siege of Lachish. And it's in that little work of art, you basically see the story of the Assyrian people, the Ninevites people, conquering the Hebrew people. And it shows them taking the Hebrew people, and within this work of art, there are Hebrews being beheaded by the Ninevites, and there are Hebrews being put up on big spikes out of the ground, just run through and then hung up there to scare the Hebrew people into giving up. I mean, these were violent people who did horrible, horrible things to the Israelites. I don't blame Jonah for saying, what, you want me to go where? I don't blame him for being surprised. I don't blame him for being scared. These were violent people. They really were wicked people. They worshipped a false god. Well, I should say gods. One of the gods was named Dagon. And this god had a wife named Nanshi. And Dagon was, this is interesting, Dagon was sometimes thought of as a god who controlled the weather. He was the storm god. He was the god of the harvest because he controlled the storms. His wife Nanshi was thought of as the god of fishing, the fish god. There were legends about her helping prophets to interpret dreams. I find that kind of ironic because here in this story we've just read, there's a great storm that's sent by the one true God. And there's a great fish that's sent by the one true God to rescue a prophet sent by the one true God. That's kind of interesting, I think. Now, Nineveh was the last place that Jonah wanted to be. And yet that's exactly where God sent him. He must have thought, I don't have anything in common with these people. They're not even Jews. Sometimes God calls us to do things that we just feel, we feel like, Lord, you must be asking the wrong person to do that. It seems out of our comfort zone. It seems like he wants us to go to people we have nothing in common with. Sometimes it seems like God wants us to do things we're afraid of. But here's the thing. Everyone, and I mean everyone, is called to belong to the one true God. Jonah's call to Nineveh was for one reason. God loved Nineveh. God loved Nineveh, and he needed someone to go and tell them that bad things were going to happen, that they were going to meet their destruction unless they repent. I'm sure Jonah thought about the people of Nineveh, and he must have thought, those people, how can I love them? Think about what they've done to my people. How could I forgive them? Think about what the people of Nineveh stand for. How can they be redeemed? How can they find redemption? And people think like that today sometimes. I think sometimes people are tempted to say, well, so-and-so or that group, they're unlovable, they're unforgivable, they're unredeemable. And the reality is that's just a lie of the devil. We worship a God who believes everybody is lovable. We worship a God who believes everybody is forgivable. And we worship a God who believes that everybody is redeemable. We are God's creation. We are his handiwork, and he loves us. God's desire to see Nineveh saved, despite their wickedness, is a testament to his love for them. That's why he sent Jonah. God did not send Jonah to Nineveh to condemn them. He sent Jonah to Nineveh that they might be saved. I think we have a similar calling. When we give our lives to Christ, when we become his people, when we are his body, his church in this world, we aren't put in the world to condemn the world. We're put in the world so that the world might be saved. As we share the hope and the joy and the good news that Jesus has made a way for us to find repentance, for us to be redeemed, for us to be forgiven. And he has done this because he loves us. Our calling is the same. We're called to participate in this creative work of redemption that God is doing in this world. It sounds cliche, but We're God's hands and feet in this world. He's chosen to work through his people. That's us. God is doing this thing in this world. He wants people to know that he is there. And the truth is, all have sinned and all have fallen short of God's glory, including us. No one can be saved by themselves. There's no way we can be good enough to save ourselves. I remember once I worked in a grocery store, and one of my jobs that I sometimes had to do was unload trucks. And we'd have these big trailer trucks that would back up, and especially during the winter, the ramp that went up to the back of the truck would get steep as the snow built up under where the truck parked. And it wasn't a bad job when you were working with other people, but it wasn't a fun job if you were out there trying to do it by yourself. And there was like this tight hallway with the truck doors here. And so you get a pallet jack and you jack up your pallet and start pulling it with all your might because it was heavy. And you'd start coming down the ramp, and then you had to turn the corner. Now this whole pallet, it's all shrink wrapped with, cases upon cases of stuff. And when you're turning that corner, that pallet wanted to tip. And sometimes it would tip far enough that it would start to go over. And you'd rush around the side and you'd catch it. If it hadn't tipped too far, you might be able to push it back up. If it tipped just a little bit more than that, you weren't going to be able to save it on your own. You hoped there was somebody else there that you could say, hey, give me a hand quick before it falls. I remember one time I was there all by myself, and I've caught it, I've stopped it from falling anymore. But then a couple of cases down low just fall out onto the floor. And now it's uneven and it's tipping more. And pretty soon all I can do is get out of the way, and the whole thing comes crashing down. I couldn't save it myself. I couldn't save it on my own. I needed help. No one is good enough or holy enough. It's only by the grace of God that we can be saved. We can't save ourselves. I heard a story about a ship that was wrecked off the coast of Scotland in 1881. The ship was taking on water and sinking, and it wasn't far from shore. And I learned something. They had this thing they called an apparatus, or a rocket apparatus. And this was back in the 1800s. They devised this thing that would shoot like a rocket-propelled rope, so that if a ship was a ways off from shore, they could shoot a rope a long ways to get it to that ship. But as this particular ship was going down in a storm, the wind was too heavy, and they'd try to shoot the rope, and it was just too light, and it wouldn't get to the ship. So they attached a small barrel to it, and that gave it enough weight so that they could launch it through the wind and rain and get it to the ship. And then ships, they also had one of those on board, and they also had a little contraption that could attach to the rope. And once they attached it to the rope, a person could get in the little contraption and be carried across the rope to shore. So they got this rope to the boat, and they hitched up the little cage thing where the person would ride, and the first person went across in the wind and the rain, and he made it to shore. And then just as he made it to shore, the thing that held the contraption on the rope let go, and it had to be reset up. And of course, there's several more guys waiting to get rescued from this ship, and they're taking valuable time to reset this apparatus for the next person. It had gotten all tangled up in the rope. Well, as they're dealing with this, one of the guys on the boat, he just decided he's gonna go across without the apparatus. He's gonna save himself, he figures. So he grabs the rope and he starts doing this hand over hand thing. He didn't get very far, and the wind and the waves swept him away. Well, they got that apparatus thing fixed up and put another person in it, and they went across. Sent it back, and another person got in it, and they went across. And everybody except that one guy who tried to do it by himself was saved. When the captain was later asked about that one man, he said this: "We tried to persuade him not to attempt such a useless task. It would be impossible for him to reach shore in that way. But he would not listen to us. He was a fine fellow. He was the best man in the crew. But he was lost because he tried to save himself in his own way. Yet all the rest were saved, but none of them by their own hands." The lesson: human powers are wholly inadequate for salvation. To rely upon them is to invite and ensure spiritual disaster. We can't save ourselves. But the good news is that we don't have to, because God journeys through this world with us. Even when we are stubborn, he gives us second chances. Man, Jonah had clear instruction from God. God told him to go this way, so he went that way. He didn't like the people God wanted him to go to. Later, he actually says, "The reason I didn't want to go is because I was afraid you would save them." Personally, I think the reason Jonah didn't want them to be saved, maybe it was just that he didn't like them, but maybe a part of it was that he wanted to be known as the prophet who preached that the city was going to be destroyed, and it really was. He wanted to be seen as his prediction coming true, I think. Jonah did get a second chance. We see the one place in this story where the fish is mentioned, and we think the fish is a bad thing, but no, the fish was an act of God's grace. It was by God's mercy that Jonah, who was drowning in the ocean, unable to save himself, was swallowed up by a fish sent from God. And when he prayed to God, the fish vomited him out. The fish spit him out on dry land. And Jonah had a second chance to go to Nineveh, despite his disobedience, despite his stubbornness. God was saying, "Let's try this again, Jonah." God didn't give up on Jonah. Nineveh got a second chance as well. I was thinking about this week, thinking